isn't it? In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we have been hearing the current ruling regime boast of what they have unfortunately labeled labor love. Note we say unfortunately labeled labor love. And Just Another Look has over time taken great pains to inform listeners that the classic evidence of labor love and what it means, what it stands for, is the way in which the ruling regime has been doing and doling out largesse to its supporters. The way in which they have been doling out largesse to their supporters. The gross discrepancy that we observe in terms of who gets what generally, but importantly, who gets what after any sort of disaster in this country under the ULP, is indicative of how the party and the government reveals its love. Think of any disaster, whether it is flooding, the outskirts of a hurricane or storm, or what have you. Remind yourselves of how the rehabilitation work is done. Who gets contracts? Even when we talk about the Lives to Live projects, who gets the cement, the galvanized, the steel, and the lumber? Who gets it? Is it always shared based on needs? Or are the needs predetermined by your political commitment and orientation and your political profession, so that they are absolutely clear who should be the recipients? How are the spoils divided? We bring in millions of dollars of material, and how is it shared? That is an indication of the labor love they profess. And so it came as no surprise some years ago that the major distribution points for cement, lumber, galvanized, and steel appeared to be associated with the candidates. The ULP's display of labor love has apparently created a new low in respect of our beggar-maid policies. The electorate are made to grovel, made to lie prostrate before the system that they must see and accept as their leadership. The average Vincentian, now wilting under the pressure of an economy on the rocks, is only just beginning to understand the true meaning of labor love. The trade union movement in the country has now come to an understanding that the term labor in the concept labor love bears no resemblance. They do not mean the same thing. And one of the most distinguishing features of the ULP's good governance strategy was made manifest in the fracas that took place in this country's parliament in 2011. The fracas began when Anim Eustace refused to take his seat. He was ordered to sit. The then Speaker of the House, Hendrickson Alexander, ordered him to sit. And Eustace remained standing in defiance of that order, with his eyes fixated on the Speaker, Hendrickson Alexander. He said nothing verbally, but his intent was very clear in his silence, in his stance, and his eyes fixated on the Speaker of the House. It was a day that no one sitting on the Parliament's benches had ever seen before in Anim Eustace. And it bothered every single member of Parliament that day. They had never seen that side to him. And so all those who thought they knew him were shell-shocked, not the least of which was the Speaker, Hendrickson Alexander, who was the recipient of the fixation of Anim Eustace's eyes. And Eustace's refusal to sit because of his principled stance resulted in his colleagues all standing as well. From our vantage point, from our analysis, the House panicked. We are convinced that Hendrickson Alexander also panicked, sitting as the Speaker of the House. And then the police were called in to remove the opposition members from the Parliament. But the police removed some members of the opposition, because it remains inexplicable to this day that they did not attempt to touch Anim Eustace, nor did they attempt to touch Sinclair Leacock. Then they removed the others. And Daniel Cummins got the worst of it. Why? We will never really know. But in dragging him outside, there was an attempt, not an attempt, they actually slammed his foot with the heavy door, as his foot kept the door ajar. And they kept banging it, banging it, banging it. Perhaps they were hoping that his foot would break then and there. But it may well have been better for him to have had his foot broken there than what happened afterwards. He was taken and flung down the steps like a rag doll. Swung down the steps by our security forces. They don't do that with common criminals. But an elected member of the nation's legislature, an elected member of the government system, because the parliament is the legislative arm of government. We have the executive, which is the cabinet, the legislature, which is the parliament, and then we have the judiciary, the three arms of government. But our national security forces were brought in and the actions in terms of the way in which they treated those that they chose to remove from parliament may well have been considered worse than how they treat common criminals in the country. So, were they operating under instructions? Were they supervised? And could there have been an intent to injure for life? You know, you wonder if some of these people have children, if they have families, husbands and wives. Just as we asked a while ago at the beginning of this program, what happens when Ralph Gonzalez looks in the mirror? Mirror, mirror on the wall. So these officers who held a parliamentarian and flung him down the stairs like a sack of potatoes, what are they thinking now as they look at themselves in the mirror? As they sit around with their families? What are they thinking now that they see Cummins having been committed to wearing a collar for the next 3 months? Having had one operation on his back and having to return for another and meet his own expenses. What do they think of themselves? When they lifted him to fling him down the steps, what were they hoping for? That he would break his neck? Is that what they were hoping would have achieved? You see, it appears that they were not satisfied that his foot was not broken when they banged the door on it. So they transformed him into a ragdoll and flung him down the steps. Labour's love did not allow for any of the members of the government side in Parliament to put a stop to the fracas. Why? Why? Were they too hoping that somebody would die in the process? How do you, as parliamentary colleagues, albeit on opposing sides, sit and look at what was obviously inhumane treatment of your fellow parliamentarians and stay silent? How do you do that and live with yourself? How do you manage that? How do you return home and sit with your family and eat a meal and not be bothered in your conscience as to what had transpired and of your silence in the process? Did their silence mean consent? Did their silence mean approval? The Minister of National Security. The Minister of National Security, the Prime Minister. What did he do? What did he do? What did he do? You see, that's how much we love one another in this country, you know. Not one of the government members of the House, and there are some who are highly religious, profoundly committed to the Christian faith, sat there as though rats had eaten their consciences. They did and said nothing to put a stop to the inhumane treatment being meted out to some members of the opposition. How do you live with yourself? How do you make it? How do you walk out of that situation and then fall on your knees and praise God? How do you do it? Not one of the government members of the House attempted to ask Cummins whether or not he was injured. Not one. Not one of them had even asked him how he paid for the operation. Instead, when he sought to bring back the chair that his doctors insisted he must use in order to alleviate the damage and the pain that comes from the damage to his back, he had to ask permission. You can't bring in a chair. You can't bring in your own chair. Of course you can't bring in your own chair. You'll disturb the decor of our lovely House of Assembly. You can't bring in your own chair. You know, we boast that we're a Christian society, but are we really? Or have we completely lost faith? We know that we've already thrown away all values, all positive values. We only use them now as part of the political maneuverings, but they really mean nothing. But you know, as fate would have it, Cummins sustained injuries that would plague him for the rest of his life. He sustained injuries that would plague him for the rest of his life. This for merely taking a political stance in the Parliament, the legislative arm of the government of this country. So, you know, we sometimes refer to the government benches in Parliament as the laughing gallery. Because there are some of them who all they do is giggle. You remember we did a program some time ago when Douglas Slater was the Minister of Health and the Environment. We actually wanted him to stop giggling in Parliament. Everything was a joke. Everything was a joke. How many of them were giggling when Cummins was being injured? How many of them were giggling? How many of them left there saying to themselves, it's good for them. It's good for them. They are, after all, honorable people, aren't they? They are all honorable people. Today, Cummins is forced to wear a collar. Since the incident, not accident, since the incident, the bones are growing in a manner that inflicts pain and would necessitate another surgical procedure. So for the next 3 months, he would have to wear the very uncomfortable collar to ease the pain from the growing bones. But the message we want to give you, dear listeners, today is that Cummins' experience in the Parliament in 2011 is a classical example not only of what labor love truly means, but also, and perhaps more importantly, about ULP politics and ULP's example of good governance. Hendrickson Alexander would forever have to live with the fact of his decision on that day. He could have put a stop to it. Why didn't he? Is a question that will bother him as long as he lives. And as long as he sees, hears of, or reads about the injuries sustained by Daniel Cummins. Every member of the government side that was in Parliament that day who stood silent will have to live with their consciences. And every time they read or hear about the impact of that fall, of that having been flung down the step in respect of Cummins, they have to live with their consciences. Each member of Parliament on that fateful day would have to live with the memory of what they watched in silence, and by extension, what in silence they allowed to happen. It is often said that the sins of the father are visited upon the children. If this is true, then the members of the government side in Parliament on that fateful day who stayed silent, as well as the Speaker of the House, as well as the police officers, and those people in the gallery who also stayed silent as they watched the horrific behavior of members of our national security forces. The police officers who somehow felt it was their solemn duty to ill-treat parliamentarians of the opposition New Democratic Party. They must all be forever bothered by their consciences. They must be forever hopeful that the saying is not true. They must be forever hopeful that the sins of the fathers are not visited upon the children. They must be forever hopeful that their children would in no way be impacted by their actions and or their inaction on the part of some on that day in our parliament. The entire episode in Parliament handed Cummings a lifelong injury, lifelong pain and discomfort. It is, dear friends, a sordid reminder that the ULP leadership is really not at all concerned about people. It is not possible to deliberately stay silent while others are being injured before your eyes, and this not be considered very, very sinful. Very, very sinful. It is not possible to deliberately stay silent while others are being injured before your eyes, and this not be considered very, very sinful. You know, Papa has long since found it opportune to quote scripture and to consistently make references to God for his blessings. The frequency of the usage seems to suggest that it may be as political in nature as it is in religion. God asks that we incessantly forgive those who seek to harm us. Papa and his minions and his parliamentarians who were there, watched and stayed silent, must hope and pray for forgiveness. Each time Cummings winces in pain, they must pray for forgiveness. Expressions of labor love is not enough to save them. Enough said. But you're listening to Just Another Look. You hear it always on Nice Radio. You know, friends, some time ago we spoke about St. Vincent and the Grenadines' support for Venezuela. Well, these days we have Louis Straker has suddenly become something of a spokesman for Venezuela. And when you listen to Louis, the only thing you could do is shake your head in awe. Because in the midst of everything that they are saying, through Louis Straker, they're forgetting the single most important thing: the suffering masses in Venezuela. We are into the politics. We're into the politics of it. We're forgetting the human side of it. But that and other matters we'll address in our next issue of Just Another Look. Because it is interesting the stand that St. Vincent and the Grenadines has taken. And at the end of the day, the Vincentian electorate needs to understand the difference between patronage, wanting to support because we have been supported, and to do so almost blindly, or to cry out for justice to be served fair play and democracy. But then if you're having challenges with those in your own country, like we are in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, then you have some issues. Then you have some major issues. Today, the 16th day of June 2018, marks 4,190 days since the disappearance of Dominic Gonzalez and Suresh Lakram. Sorry, it's Dominic Gonzalez and Rashid Ibrahim in J8VAX. They disappeared on the 19th of November 2006. And just another look likes to remind ourselves of the Cockamamie report that was hastily done and put out. We're not sure who that was intended to satisfy, but somebody seemed to find it necessary to publish the report. Yeah, but they never found a trace of the plane. Just inside of 4 years later, on Thursday, the 5th of August 2010, Suresh Lakram called off from his leave to do a mercy mission in the opposite direction. J8VX was coming from Canoan to St. Vincent. The last we heard was a report saying that the pilot, Dominic Gonzalez, had said he was off Beckway, and then talked about the Liat that was coming in, and that he was going to allow the Liat plane to come in first. That's the last we heard of it. Inside of 4 years later, Suresh Lakram is called to take a mercy mission in Canoan. So he leaves St. Vincent to go to Canoan with J8SXY, and that's the last we heard of him. But somehow, the authorities here didn't seem to think that it was necessary to publish any report on the disappearance of J8SXY, another SVG Air aircraft, inside of 4 years of the disappearance of the previous plane. So why was it not necessary, to explain to Vincentians what happened? How could the same airline within 4 years lose a second plane and we didn't seem overly concerned? What is wrong with us as a people? Was it because we didn't have anybody on it other than the pilot? Even so, did we care about him and his family? So we didn't need a report? You rushed to publish the report, Cockamamie as it was, on J8VAX inside of 4 years earlier. But for J8SXY, we didn't seem to think it necessary. In our airspace, 2 planes disappear inside a 5-year period and nothing. But then again, why should it surprise us? Why should we be in any way surprised? This is the system under which we live. This is the system under which we live. And we started off by telling you it is a prime ministerial government. It is a prime ministerial government. So we have to understand who dictates what in our society. And then, dear friends, we have to remind you of the tragic death of Patricia Bowman. We take no joy in having to bring up these cases. But on the 19th of September 2008, Patricia Bowman was crushed to death in her car on her way to work. the wall of somebody's property fell on her car. And the niceties of our jurisprudence has left her husband, Alban Bowman, still grieving. Because our legal authorities did not seem to think her life important enough. Or so it seems. Because if you're going to leave it for Alban to have to find a way to make a case when John Public knows that she was on her way to work and somebody's wall fell on her house. That was in 2008, the 19th of September. 10 years later, our legal system does not tell us who is responsible. They have not told us who is responsible. And so, the Director of Public Prosecutions Department did not think it necessary to make a case. That is justice for you under our system. That is justice for you under our system. So you understand why people prefer to stay with the colonial bastion, the Privy Council, than to trust our own regional and national legal systems. That is the bothersome thing. Because we have remained so colonial in our thinking. We've remained so myopic in our behavior that for all the fanciful talk of a so-called education revolution, we continue to believe and to thrive by seeking to fool as many of the people all of the time. Enough said. You've been listening to another edition of Nice Radio's Callaloo presentation, Just Another Look. Just Another Look is an innovative, exciting, albeit decidedly provocative, and yes, certainly controversial socio-political analysis of issues of a local, regional, and international nature. Just Another Look is heard only on Nice Radio, first aired on Saturdays at 6 p.m., repeated on Sundays at 9 p.m. You can always catch us on the World Wide Web, www.niceradio.info. You can always check out our Just Another Look blog, www.justanotherlook.com. I am, of course,